So the Global Virum Project was something that actually started up. It was kind of in thought and batted around, I would say, starting around 2015. And it was this idea that you would go out and collect viruses, go to different parts of the world, collect viruses that might become dangerous at one time, and then you bring them back and you'd study them. I don't know the exact parameters of what exactly they wanted to do, but like it was basically a virus collection program and collecting DNA and viruses and stuff like that. And what came out a few years ago is our emails from mostly like UC Davis and also from the State Department that showed that it actually was created illegally. It was done with funds from the State Department that were misdirected. These were funds that were appropriated through Congress to run a program called PREDICT. And what PREDICT was a really big program. A lot of the money flowed through UC Davis, and a lot of it then went over to a small nonprofit called EcoHealth Alliance. And EcoHealth Alliance, of course, is the nonprofit that we found out that Fauci was funding, that was then had a subcontract to the Wuhan Institute of Virology. And EcoHealth Alliance was they were banned from HHS funding about a month ago. There's more and more articles about bird flu constantly hitting about the need to do everything, and how we can't have a sort of refocus of public health into dealing with chronic diseases, something that we know is killing people right now. Yeah. It's not a theoretical thing that might happen, next season, or, something that starts in China and then gets transferred over. It is killing Americans today. Millions of Americans die every year because of chronic diseases. The obesity rates are crazy. And so what we're trying to do is refocus. And I think as they refocus, what you're going to see is more and more of this clamoring to let's do viruses and let's have more about vaccines. I mean, to me, one of the funniest things is how, places like Public Citizen, right? Traditionally very much, activists going after big pharma, and they've been totally silent on all the problems with the vaccines. I've not seen a single press release about them coming out anything about any vaccine side effects. Alex Berenson wrote a piece. He found out that in some of the clinical trial data for the Pfizer vaccine, it was reported that a kid had died. It was an adverse event, a small child. I posted this on Facebook. I had reporters making comments like, well, yeah, but the vaccine was still effective and everything. I was like, that's not the point. The point is the company lied and hid the fact that there was an adverse event and a girl died. Don't you get that's the point?
I'm honored today to have investigative journalist Paul Thacker, and the different definitions of journalism we're finding out based on the USAID. And Paul, how come you're not on the take? I just don't understand this.
On what? On what take?
On the take, on the USAID.
On the take. Well, it's really funny with the USAID stuff coming out. Carl Bernstein wrote an article that I don't think most people know about, but it came out in 1976. And it was, this is of course after he, was famous for the Watergate story. But he left the Washington Post for 6 months and took a bunch of material that had come to light from the Church Commission. The Church Commission was one of it's the only time that we've actually had Congress investigate the intelligence agencies, because we found out things that they were terrible things they were doing, spying on Americans when they weren't supposed to be doing that, attempts to kill people abroad, some of the psychedelic experiments with different drugs and stuff and killing agents. And he left and wrote it's about 25,000 word article. You can find it on his website today. And it was all about how the CIA co-opted the media. And one example in there were 10 people who were CIA agents who were given New York Times reporter as their cover to put them abroad. So I mean, and there was also happening at Newsweek and at Time. There's the whole. When you look back at the history of the CIA, one of the Dulles brothers was great friends with, I think his name was Luce, who owned Time magazine. So, I mean, there's been this collusion between the intelligence agencies and the media forever. And I was kind of shocked first off that they're going to destroy USAID. But when you think about it, like, who is their natural constituents? Because people on the left have not liked USAID for decades because they know it's a front for the intelligence agencies. It's come out that like some of the HIV clinics were ways that they were using to just recruit people. Some of the vaccination programs were used for DNA collection purposes. And so they have this cover in which they pretend to be doing, being do-gooders in public health, but it's just serving as a front oftentimes for intelligence stuff. And so the left has never really liked it, like the real left. And on the right, they don't like it because they don't like the funding and the money going out the door. So I've concluded that the only people who really like USAID are members of the Democratic Party, card-carrying members of the Democratic Party who live within an hour of DC and go downtown and do a protest for CNN and MSNBC. That's who I think, like, in the country really supports it. Right. Because and the money that's coming out is just kind of crazy. And I don't totally know. I'm seeing stuff on the web that's popping up, but it's not totally clear how much of that really is bad or what. But to me, the funniest one was there's this group called the GIJN. I can't remember what it's called, like for International Journalism Network. And they're complaining, saying, restore USAID government funding so that we can go and investigate government corruption. Like, that was literally like, when you cut it off, I was like, hold on here. Like, wait, like, do you not, and I saw reporters were sharing this. It's like reporters who like aren't smart enough to go and like just ask questions and be like, so I get on there and I see it on Facebook. I'm like, have you not read this article by this guy you might have heard of called Carl Bernstein? He exposed all this 5 decades ago.
Now, it's a funny thing. I have to say, I wasn't really happy during the Obama regime for Obama's policies. And again, later during Biden. I'm kind of a conservative and Republican by title in a sense. But, a lot of Republicans kind of see themselves as classical liberals and kind of the JFK wing that disappeared. But I'm not sure JFK was all that and whatnot. But anyway, the only thing I really liked about the Obama years and then Biden essentially is that there was kind of a quiet. During the Bush years, there was all this, clamoring in the press. They had the corpses, the coffins coming back with the flags, and they did all the daily, casualties in Iraq, and it was endless bad news. And then when Obama got to be president, it was just quiet. I'm not saying the news got better, but it was quiet. It was like, oh, you don't have to like have this kind of hammered into you. Obviously, you don't have to watch it at all. But that was a time when I think people were more tuned into legacy media. But clearly, the journalism's like they're like I don't know, cicadas. I used to call them locusts. Whatever. I think the Bible they call it locusts. But they kind of every 17 years the locust cicadas wake up and they do their devastation. In this case, the journalists seem to only awake if the guy in office hasn't that little pendulous R after his name.
Right. Exactly. Yeah. Yeah, no, I know. So to me, the major change that happened in the media was sometime around 2016. And I can't tell you what it was, but there was just things I noticed. And I noticed, I was a guy who, I didn't like Trump, but, and it's what's so funny is a lot of people that I read also didn't like Trump, but it was people that like Glenn Greenwald, Matt Taibbi and stuff. But they were being called Trump because they would say things like, well, Trump's not a great guy, but he didn't do this, Right. And what the media started doing is I called it it's essentially they were bad cops, right? So they were cops who basically the guy's a drug dealer and you don't like him, but you didn't catch him with drugs. So you're going to plant something on him, or I got him with drugs, but let me plant this gun on him too. And that's going to go a federal rap and he's going to go away 10 years. And that's the way the media has been acting since around 2016 for reasons that I don't totally understand. I still to this day don't totally understand the antipathy, but I see it happening, even today. I'll just give you an example. There's a reporter, a foreign policy reporter for USA Today named Josh. It's public, so it just doesn't matter. Josh Meyer. And he wrote this piece about how it was something like people are disappointed, or people have tried to stop Tulsi Gabbard, but she might get through. So, and what might this do? Will our foreign adversaries, or will our foreign allies still trust us? She becomes head of the intelligence. And so I was like, well, why would they not trust us? Like, what's this all about? Like, why would you even say that? And he's like, well, there's these concerns about that she's, close to Russia and everything. I was like, no, there's no concern about that. It's just people keep saying she's close to Russia. So that's what they say. But what's the evidence there? I've talked to national security people, and there's nothing in the intelligence, in the classified material that says this. It's just Democrats repeating the same thing over and over again. And he's like, well, here's what I reported on this. I was like, yeah, you reported on the same stuff that I just said. That's not proof. You having Democrats say this doesn't make it true. You keep repeating the same thing over and over again. So there's just this weirdness with, the media. Part of the problem is the media has just become too aligned with one political party. And the point isn't that they need to become aligned with the Republican Party. They just need to stop aligning themselves with political parties, or they need to have
do their job. Bill Belichick. Yeah. It's like, get out there and do your job. You're playing defense. You're playing offense. You're this. You're the quarterback. You're the cornerback. You're special teams. Yeah. Do your job. But right. I have a close and distant relative at the same time, formerly close relative, and he's a journalist. And we had this discussion. I bring this up here and there. At one point, he was between jobs, and he spent decades at Columbia University, journalism school, lived there, blah, blah, blah. That was his life. And Obama, had this Columbia connection. He went from Occidental, and he wound up accidentally at Columbia. But nobody has no record of him. There's no, it's a kind of a ghost thing. And I said to my close but distant relative at the time, I said, why don't you do a story about this? And, you can probably get the Atlantic or whatever to, pay you for it and so forth, because he has zillions of Columbia contacts. You can go back in the retrospectoscope and find people. And he's like, I would never do that. So, well, why not? He says, well, because it's a crappy idea. So, well, why is it a crappy idea? It's just journalism. This is a story nobody's doing. And you have incredible, anyway. So he said, well, you don't understand what journalism is. Journalism is about pushing the narrative. And if I push the narrative and I find out, that things aren't as they should be, or as we thought, then he might not get the nomination. You're just running flack. And I think there's kind of this complicity aspect. I mean, he wasn't getting paid for that because he wasn't getting paid at all at the time. But there's this kind of complicity. I personally, to kind of answer your previous question, what happened in 2016, I think it happened earlier and during the Obama era that basically they padded the institutions. The CIA was bad during the Church Commission and whatnot. But the CIA became good when it was filled with your peeps. And right. Everything kind of Obama's chief quality, I guess, went to law school and all that, but he was a community activist or a community organizer, and he organized these communities, and everything became siloed with a different kind of political stripe, through the FBI. And I think there was a turning, and the whole essence of the kind of the Hillary, secret server was not the secret server per se, was the fact that she was running a side business, selling, influence to herself, through the State Department. You want this thing. And I think the USAID experiment, they figured out a way of cashing in, payola aspect, making the government into a racket that's a private, wholly owned subsidiary of the Democratic Party. And I think the huge antipathy and reaction to anything that's not them is that they have their money flow. I mean, this is I just think it's a pretty open and shut case. I mean, we'll find out the evidence later. I don't want to let the evidence stand in the way of my opinions, but I don't know. What are your thoughts about that?
Well, I mean, so you said a lot there, but the one thing I can tell you is that, I mean, when you look at the last thing that Biden did on his way out the door, as he was walking out the door actually for Trump swearing in, the last thing they did was this pardon for all his family members. His son, he did that a month prior, but the last day he pardoned all these family members. Now, people I've spoken to have told me what's behind that is it's not just Hunter Biden, who was getting, these cush, jobs with foreign countries and, with foreign. I mean, it's just weird that I think he was taking in something like $50,000 a month. That was the retainer from some company in Ukraine. while his dad was overseeing like Ukraine policy, and then he lied about that, and we find out that that wasn't true, and like the lies kept like, I didn't talk to them, and like, well, I didn't talk to them on his behalf, and like, well, I was never in the room, and the story kept changing over and over again. But there's some pretty decent evidence that it wasn't just Hunter Biden, that there was money flowing to other people whose last name was Biden into bank accounts from foreign sources. And you just kind of like, why else do you pardon people? It's like, what are they going to find out about you? And one of them, of course, was his brother. I mean, what I was hearing from people is that like Hunter Biden wasn't even really as bad as Joe Biden's brother. So, there's just, I think the game has gotten way more complicated. And I mean, this is not something that we suspected in the past. I mean, there's been some issues on, some minor amounts of foreign money, that pour into elections here in the United States. It's there. I mean, to me, the one I remember was during Al Gore, when he was running for president, and it came out that these, some small amount of Chinese money had come in, and then he turned around and gave it back, and it was like this, I was like $20,000 or $30,000. Like, it wasn't even some huge amount. And it's like, oh, this might influence him. And I remember the funny thing was like, how can it influence them? They didn't even know about it. It took it, like they had to go figure, like, was there this money from this or not? But like now I think, I just think there's a lot more questions out there about foreign money coming into America and influencing things. I mean, another one, for example, is this group called, that I reported on, called the Center for Countering Digital Hate, which is a nonprofit that's supposedly exposing hate and misinformation. But it was starting in London by political operatives for the Labour Party. The first thing they did is they took out the left in the Labour Party, and then put Keir Starmer into power, and then jumped across the Atlantic, landed in DC, and began working to go after anyone who was a political opponent of the Democratic Party in the United States. So in October, Matt Taibbi and I wrote this piece that came out and was on BBC Morning America, apparently, about how they were closely allied with, Morgan McSweeney, who's the chief of staff to Keir Starmer, the Prime Minister of England. And so I just think there's a lot more interest now in how this foreign money is coming in and trying to affect things domestically here.
Yeah. I would just make a little slight asterisk. I mean, you're more knowledgeable than I am on all these topics, but when it's foreign, what I think there is in football, there's a flea flicker play,
right?
Which is the quarterback gets the ball. He kind of does a pseudo lateral, but it's backwards lateral. Then the other guy's got the ball, and he's either going to pass or brings it back to the quarterback, and then the quarterback throws it. So it's kind of a passing back and forth. I think a lot of this stuff is just that. I mean, when we say foreign, I think there's not really foreign as kind of supranational. It's something that goes above and beyond national borders. And there's basically this blob of NGOs that I think Obama kind of weaponized or armed in the sense of giving money. And it's kind of this offloading of government from the legislative A to the bureaucracy B, and from the bureaucracy to these kind of extra bureaucracy that's untouchable by congressional oversight. So it's a matter of kind of this flea flicker aspect, passing the ball from the legislative, where we have to make decisions, be accountable, to the bureaucracy, and it's kind of like nothing out there. It's all just doing this stuff kind of on a regular rote pattern. And then they're sending the money out to these NGOs, which have this regulatory capture aspect. So the people who are sending the money out get their kickback.
Right.
And then the NGOs are doing this stuff that's in your national interest theoretically, but you don't want to be held accountable for it. And then they take on their own power, and then they're going to, I think it's all in league with this kind of like, globalist agenda, WEF, whatever. But all these NGOs are kind of like they form their own government that's going to influence. I think we saw this during COVID, that everyone seemed to be having that lockstep. I'm sure you've seen that thing where the newscaster in one, in I don't know, Iowa says one thing, and then they multiply the screen, and everyone's saying the same. This is a threat to our democracy. And there's a whole chorus, like they're singing from the same song sheet. And this is kind of the external money that's coming in, and it's coming in, and so it's a way of just passing the money around. It's all kind of a payola scheme, racketeering or whatever. I think there's a mafiocracy that's been, kind of running things. And it's
Well, part of the way, part of what people have argued is that this might have been what the whole Ukraine thing was about, where there's foreign aid flowing into Ukraine, and then the stuff for Hunter Biden actually was the kickback for, we put him, and people are misdirecting it. They're thinking that they gave him a job because he could get influence from his dad to help their company, but like, you had the whole thing backwards. Like, he was given the job because of the foreign money that had already come in from the United States into Ukraine. Yeah. And so we had the whole thing kind of backwards, and that, there could be some of that going on. I mean, I remember when the Clinton Foundation, first came on the scene back in 2008 or whenever it was. Like, I just thought the whole thing was very weird and very creepy, because I was like, wow, this is weird. Like, this woman's Secretary of State, and then there's this nonprofit that has her name on it that nominally is run by her husband and her daughter, that's raising money from all these foreign governments, and like, that's not considered problematic. And what was funny about all that was, getting back to that whole thing about how, like, certain politicians, if the R is after their name, they get scrutiny. It didn't get a lot of scrutiny, and yet, there was like a ton of stories written about the Trump Foundation, what it was called. And I looked it up, and it was like $1 million a year that it was taking. And it was like this tiniest, like, nothing nonprofit, I mean, it took in over a decade, like $10 million, and the Post wrote story after story about it. And I think they won a Pulitzer over this thing. Meanwhile, the Clinton Foundation was raising, hundreds of millions of dollars. It was just, I mean, it was just kind of it was really kind of a nutty moment, and that reporter now, David Fairnhold, is now at the New York Times. It's like he was rewarded for this crappy reporting.
Yeah, it seems, again, it's just kind of weird times. I want to segue slightly to GVP and metabiota. And those are terms perhaps not in the general knowledge base, but you've written about it. It's not quite firmly in my knowledge base either. So can you educate us on the topic, and what are those things?
So the Global Virome Project was something that actually started up. It was kind of in thought and batted around, I would say, starting around 2015. And it was this idea that, you would go out and collect viruses, go to different parts of the world, collect viruses that might become dangerous at one time, and then you bring them back and you'd study them. I don't know the exact parameters of what exactly they wanted to do, but like, it was basically a virus collection program and collecting DNA and viruses and stuff like that. And what came out a few years ago are emails from mostly like UC Davis, and also from the State Department, that showed that it actually was created illegally. It was done with funds from the State Department that were misdirected. These were funds that were appropriated through Congress to run a program called PREDICT. And what PREDICT was a really big program. A lot of the money flowed through UC Davis, and a lot of it then went over to a small nonprofit called EcoHealth Alliance. And EcoHealth Alliance, of course, is the nonprofit that we found out that Fauci was funding, that was then had a subcontract to the Wuhan Institute of Virology. And EcoHealth Alliance was they were banned from HHS funding about a month ago. And so what State Department people did is, there was a group of them internally, and it was a group, it was a guy called, I'm blanking on his name right now, Daniel, I'm blanking on his name right now. But he was a State Department official. It was him, people from EcoHealth Alliance, people from Metabiota, and they worked together to take this PREDICT money with some academics and push it instead into the creation of the Global Virome Project. And then after they created that, the State Department guy retired and then took a job at the Global Virome Project. So he basically used government monies to create his retirement job, which is of course illegal, and, the Global Virome Project, the board was then people from Metabiota, people from UC Davis, people from EcoHealth Alliance. And it's not. I'm not totally sure where they're. Oh, that's the guy I'm talking about.
Dennis
I'm sorry,
Dennis Carroll.
Dennis Carroll. Yeah, Dennis Carroll is the scientist at State Department who like engineered all this stuff and then retired. Apparently, there was a criminal investigation that was started against him by the USAID. I'm sorry, it wasn't State Department money. It was USAID money. And apparently, there's a criminal investigation started to look into all this. And then, of course, the USAID IG just got fired a couple of days ago. He never did, probably because he didn't do anything about all this. He got referrals from several congressional offices to look into this stuff. And so we don't really know kind of where it went, but I think what it then started doing, it started partnering with China. But it's just this sort of entity that like we created with American money that then began looking all over the place for, to Gates Foundation. Gates is very interesting, like all the stuff that he funds that totally unaccountable. And then the Chinese to also go and get money. What it's actually doing today, I'm not really sure. I do know, I'm trying to think if they took their website down or not. No, it might not have been them. It might have been someone else that just took their website down recently when a lot of the stuff came out. But my guess is they're going to disappear now because they know that they're going to be a target for potential criminal investigations.
Yeah. No, it's amazing stuff. I wrote on this topic at Brownstone, EcoHealth Alliance's Wuhan virus dalliances. It almost rhymes. It looks like it should rhyme. And this was ancillary to my article on Dr. Fauci. I've got a couple 3 articles on Dr. Fauci, his own gain of function. But there was multiple layers of questions like why we had to do this. How much of the COVID debacle was a bunch of CYA, cover your tuchus, kind of aspect of schemes where there was complicity from Dr. Fauci on the Wuhan fingerprints, and they just had to kind of double down to kind of come out at the other end. That they were part and parcel of the connivance and creation of the SARS-CoV-2. So it seems that John Stewart was on with Stephen Colbert probably a year and a half ago, and it said, isn't it Colbert was still maintaining the illusion that this kind of came out of the pangolins in the wet markets in Wuhan and whatnot. But he's like, John Stewart's like, isn't it kind of interesting? It comes from the Wuhan new virology, new virus institute and whatnot. But it seems to be, and so Stewart comes up with this thing. It's like, isn't it great that we have science to fix the thing that science brought on us?
Right.
Like Homer Simpson used to say about beer, it's the cause of and solution to all of life's problems. It seems that we have a situation here where, we're banging ourselves in the head and then we're trying to find a cure for it.
Well, I think the idea that I use is that, this is because when all these virologists then come running back to Congress and say, give us more money, what they're doing right now, like, look at bird flu, we need more money. And it's essentially as if, you got the fire department, coming back to the city council and saying, we need more money because, the whole city burned down. And we're like, well, the city burned down because you guys had a barbecue that got out of control at the fire department. Like, what's going on? Like, that's not the solution, No,
it's a funny thing. So my most, it's not about me here, but the most recent article I wrote for Brownstone was on ASPR and BARDA, and the so I'll pop it up here for a second, but I use that similar kind of analogy. The Dr. Fauci wound up kind of duplicating the Department of Defense biodefense issues and brought it over to the kind of NIH side, to NIAID, and augmented his own salary as a result. So he went from here to here. I'm pretty sure that he was the highest paid member of government through this entire duration from 2006 on, because he wound up doubling his portfolio. But the analogy I use is the same thing. That some theorize, I used a kind of passive voice here, some theorize that Ivans, the Army anthrax guy, probably the Amerithrax perpetrator in 2001, if we remember anthrax, was like a fireman who doubles as an arsonist, orchestrated the attacks to magnify society's needs for his expertise. This potential scenario foreshadows these institutions' ability similarly to exploit threats to underscore their own indispensability in managing them. So if you keep enough threats going, then you have, you'll make your own need for yourself. The other analogy I use in the article is literally my dad. I grew up in the Bronx, and he was living in the Bronx, and driving to take the bus into Manhattan, subway and whatnot. And at the bus stop, they say, "Oh, Mr. Bach, what do you do?" He says, "I'm the tiger catcher for the Bronx." And they're like, "But there are no tigers in the Bronx." He'd be like, "You're welcome." See what a good job I'm doing. But it's like, a fair number of these organizations kind of shadowy. They're protecting us against these tigers. Now, maybe there are no tigers there, but they say that they're tiger. They're the tiger catchers of the Bronx. They're preventing all these bad things from happening. You don't see all the great work they're doing. Now, it could be they're keeping us from hacking and EMDs and anthrax and whatnot every single day. We have no idea. But conversely, the time that there was potentially something from abroad, which was COVID-19, SARS-CoV-2, I personally don't think it was all that bad a virus. I think it was bad, but not horrible. But I think they did the opposite. I think they buoyed it as this Chinese bioweapon and sold it to Donald Trump, not to help fix us, but to help fix themselves and give power to them. And I think the real virus, this is my other quasi-conspiracy theory, is that the real virus was not SARS-CoV-2, was Donald Trump, in their view. And he had to be expunged and immunologically removed from the body politic, i.e. the White House and whatnot. And they used this other functionality of SARS-CoV-2 to, which they had created and inadvertently let out. But once it was out, they used it, as any weapon in a fight, and to club somebody else over the head with it, rather than doing a mea culpa, dying on their own sword for having brought it about. I don't know if you, is there a question there? I don't know. So do you think SARS-CoV-2 was manipulated for political purposes, I guess?
Well, I mean, that's kind of for political purposes. I mean, definitely, I think the pandemic was highly political the way it was run. I've talked to a lot of people who've tried to figure out how they think this whole pandemic might have started. There's a couple different ideas, from people who are definitely, I mean, look, there's going to be more and more information. The latest thing that came out was a CIA assessment that was released in the first week after Trump was brought in, sworn into office. But that assessment was actually done under Biden, is completed under Biden. And it's for obvious reasons. They knew that, the guy coming in to run the CIA had already said that, the evidence shows from the classified information shows this thing came from a lab. I've talked to several people who've also said the same thing. There's documents sitting over a SCIF in the Senate that there's senators I know right now that are viewing it that have not been declassified yet. They're going to show the same thing. The guy who came in to run the CIA has said that they're going to declassify more information. So the information that's going to keep coming out is going to show more and more evidence that this thing came from a lab, right? I mean, that's the direction we're going in. So then the question becomes what were the Chinese doing? And there's a couple different theories. One is that, they were screwing around with this thing, like what people do, let's mess around with this virus and see what happens, and then see about protective measures and everything. And then it just escaped. The other theory is that they actually had it as a bioweapon. And what they were doing is they were creating a vaccine for it. And as can happen with vaccines, sometimes when you're vaccinated with a virus, you revert back to infected. And that's how the thing got out. Yeah. So there's a couple ideas about, what might have happened that caused this thing to get out. But, I mean, the information that, the Chinese know, or maybe they don't, maybe they themselves don't totally know, the accidents happen and they don't realize what the accident was. And there's a good possibility that, intelligence people know that, there's, I think, more and more evidence coming out. There's another guy already just went on Australian TV and said that, our intel sources inside the Wuhan lab were Australian. But I think what's becoming more and more clear is that we had people inside those labs that, were working for American intelligence. And so they know what happened. So the CIA probably knows what's happened. There's also the Wall Street Journal has reported to some degree about a Department of Energy report that is classified. And they've reported on some of it, but the vast majority of that report is still classified. So that might be classified also. Yeah. And all these things are going to point more and more at this lab.
Are you familiar with Matthew Tye?
I'm sorry?
Are you familiar with Matthew Tye, Tye?
No.
I wrote about him also. This is the kind of Randy Bach's greatest hits. The amateur who unraveled Wuhan. So he's a independent documentarian. He's kind of a YouTube guy who's living in China. He's had a Chinese wife. And at the time, he'd just take his moped or motorcycle and zip around. He did a lot of, small town stuff throughout China. He speaks fluent Chinese. When Wuhan came about, the Wuhan episode, whatnot, he just, kind of did primary sources. He did a lot of people's own, social media, such as it is, and news stories and whatnot. And I think he's done a really excellent job. It's not really well popularized in the press. That's why I kind of wrote about him. He was, kind of dehumanized by the Chinese. He had to leave. So he's not in China anymore. But they actually made a really interesting thing. They made a visual Matthew Tye. They found another American who sort of looks like him, and he dresses like him. And basically they have him saying Chinese stuff, Chinese propaganda stuff. And it's just kind of funny. But they did it so you kind of confuse the two guys. If you go to Matthew Tye videos, you'll see this guy, maybe his name is Tathu Mai or something like that. But they have a guy, clearly he's almost like a Donald Trump impersonator, but for Matthew Tye. And they say pro-China stuff, and they kind of want to debunk his stuff. So, when they're doing all this kind of like, oh, don't look at this guy. I think you have to go look at this guy. And his contemporaries, YouTubes were very, matter of fact, they took, probably, 30 cents and a couple hours to put together. And he just goes through all the social media stuff that's happening at the time, job posts, people go missing, the things they're looking for, certain labs. Anyway, he kind of pins it down, based on kind of this metadata aspect of what happened and where and when, specifically which part of the WIV and whatnot. It's well worth, going over his stuff. I never have heard from him.
What's funny when you say that he got bounced out of China, he's not the only one. One of the reporter groups, spoke about, there was something like, I think, 8 or something Chinese journalists that, were locked up for reporting about the pandemic outbreak, and so I think one of them was just released recently, like in the last year or so. So China definitely shut these people down. And I also reported on, there was a study, it's really funny, done by economists. One of them was an economist at Ohio State. Another one was a doctor, I want to say, at Washington University in St. Louis. He's actually Chinese. And they did a report trying to figure out when the pandemic started based upon the number of people who were being cremated around Wuhan. Right. And so they tracked it back to that the pandemic actually started, I want to say, in not November, but August or October.
Yeah, August. There was another one, similar kind of metadata aspect where they were looking at, and they did satellite photos of interest and activity around certain hospitals. I mean, I don't think they don't drive as much. I had back in the pre-internet days, I was on another air flight, and I sat next to this guy, and he tells me what he's doing for a living. And basically he's doing what satellites and stuff do now. This is probably 35, 40 years ago. And he was part of an investment company. They did restaurants. And so it was nice that, say, I don't know, what's a chain restaurant?
Applebee's.
Applebee's says they're doing this much business, and we'd like to take their word for it. But he goes around and he looks at the parking lot at different hours. So he'll suss that out, take photographs of the parking lot. And obviously this stuff can be done better now. We have geolocation, we got phones, and people liking things, whatever, all kinds of metadata. But he was the metadata at the time. So they basically stuck him on airplanes, and he would go around and check out all the Applebee's of the metropolitan area around Philadelphia, whatever. That's kind of what he did. But yeah, I think Matthew Tai did a fair number of that. I just kind of popped up his doppelganger here. This is what the Chinese did to him. I mean, it's very sophisticated. So they had, here's real Matthew Tai. I mean, this is not a joke. I mean, it is a joke, but it's not a joke. This is the guy that they pay this guy to put out stories that contradict this guy's stuff, so you'll just be befuddled by the whole thing. It's just kind of an amazing thing. So I think he's kind of an episode that people haven't really looked at that much. But when I saw it back in the dark days, we were kind of huddled up in our Lascaux caves, doing writing on the walls and whatnot because we couldn't get out. But I came upon him, and he was like a real light in the tunnel that he was putting this stuff out. It was very accessible, but totally ignored. I just don't understand. People looked in certain places. So again, kind of my Fauci research. I have Fauci 1.0 and Fauci 2.0, where I think he was a well-meaning but somewhat bumbling, head in the clouds kind of guy. For a lot of stuff, he said disingenuously but correctly. He followed reasonable public health statutes, but then something happened to and with and for and about him, where he became Fauci 2.0, kind of like the which one's with Mr. Hyde to Dr. Jekyll.
I think he's a full-on sociopathic liar. I mean, it took me a while to come to that. I mean, but like it's like history just shows that like every time there's more emails that come out, it shows that he knew something and said something different. I think it's very clear that from the beginning, he was lying from the beginning. When you start looking at the emails, the fact that he's been caught. There's a guy, Matt Orfalea, who a videographer who works sometimes with Matt Taibbi, and he's put together like a thing where you can see like Fauci saying like oh, masks don't work, like you have to wear a mask, and like don't worry about lockdowns, like no, we need lockdowns, like just back and forth Tony Fauci, I honestly think the guy's a pathological liar, and I think that's exactly why he had to get a pardon from the president of the United States, because I wrote a piece on this. He lied several times to Congress. It's very clear that he was involved in research misconduct in a paper that was called Proximal Origins, that was published in Nature Medicine. And it looks like he may have done a quid pro quo in giving a grant to the lead author in that Nature Medicine paper, because that paper basically absolved Fauci of any liability for his funding at Wuhan, because it said like he couldn't have started in a lab, and after he published that piece, he got like a $9 million grant afterwards.
Yeah, no, there's a lot of payola. I just think that, this is my own compilation of Fauci 1.0 and Fauci 2.0. And the title of my article is Dr. Fauci's DNA of Caring, which is his self-appellation. He just, gosh darn it, he just grew up caring so much. His dad was a pharmacist in Brooklyn. And
I'll just tell you this. I'm going to be writing about this pretty soon, but I just got off the phone with someone who worked for him. And I have a source inside the NIH. You know who he had a photo of in his office at the NIH? The Godfather.
Oh, there you go.
He sees himself as a kind of a mafia figure. And I've heard this over and over and over again about him from several physicians who've dealt with him over the years, which is that, he considers himself mafia-like, and, he's a kind of a pharma mafia. He sees himself as above reproach. He's his own person. And to me, the thing that really turned to me was when he was in the ahead, in front of the Senate, and Senator Rand Paul was asking him questions and catching him in lies. And he started poking his finger at Senator Paul and accusing him of lying. I mean, I'd never seen that before in my life. I ran congressional investigations. I've sent letters to people and to their lawyers warning them about the legal liability if they lie or mislead Congress. And I just watched Fauci, and I remember I picked up my phone and I started calling. I'm in Madrid. I started calling a friend back in DC, and I'm like, oh my God, Fauci just lied, like on live television, lied before Congress on live television. It's amazing.
Yes.
I'd see the guy. He's a pathological liar.
Yeah, it's a funny thing. I don't want to spend too much time on this, but this is similarly, what he said here in this interview, where he's with, I don't know, where he says, I had the DNA of caring for people. Discussed his new book with whoever Jeff Bennett is, maybe NPR or something like that. He's going back for his self-criticism about what he did during HIV. He said the institutions were domineering and unheeding of criticism. So therefore, he realized, because he has his DNA of caring, we at the time we'd said, we know best for you. We're the scientists. We're the ones with experience. And they kept saying, no, we really want to see to the table. This is HIV, the homosexual kind of quote unquote community and whatnot. And as John Lewis was kind of, at Martin Luther King's ancillary later on, there's trouble and there's good trouble. They were making good, the HIV activists, they were making good trouble in the field of health, wanting to have a seat at the table. One of the best things I've done in my career, this is Fauci saying, was to put aside the theatrics and listen to what they were saying, because what they were saying made absolutely perfect sense. And I remember saying to myself, if I were in their shoes, I'd be doing exactly what they're doing. And so he says, your HIV experience was enlightening. So how did it inform your approach moving forward to confront other epidemics? Well, I listen to the patients, and don't think that everything comes from the top down. This is a guy saying this after COVID.
Yeah, I know. Right.
I saw this. I had the article in mind already, and I came upon this interview, the whole DNA of caring thing, and to think that was the lesson he got from HIV, and that he's going to bring it. But he did exactly the opposite during COVID. Moreover, this one weird irony for me is that the whole kind of concept of waiting for a vaccine during COVID. Now, if he was came to prominence during HIV. If we had been waiting for a vaccine for HIV, let me check my watch, 40 years later, counting, we'd still be waiting. The therapeutics were the treatment. They are the treatment for a virus, much more deadly virus than SARS-CoV-2. And why wouldn't you emphasize therapeutics, given your great experience, your enlightenment from having had an HIV AIDS episode and not having listened to the activists who were being quote unquote oppressed by NIH inaction and whatnot. Now, this is far worse because he did the whole entire population, and he did much more aggressive action towards, the great population over a respiratory virus than he did to the HIV, susceptible homosexual community in New York and whatnot during AIDS. But, I'm flummoxed by the whole thing.
Well, one of the things that I think was the problem that, people talk about, but it hasn't really been emphasized, is I think one of the problem with how we dealt with this this respiratory virus pandemic is we brought all these experts whose expertise was an HIV pandemic, and they goddamn didn't understand that it's a completely different epidemiology. They kept applying their lessons learned from HIV. I used to say it's literally like your car breaks down and it's like, oh, well, let's bring in this guy. He's a mechanic. Like, what does he fixes, washing machines. Like, I've got a Ford car. I need a guy to work on a Ford car. Like, you're bringing me a guy who knows how to fix dishwashers. It's like these guys thought that because, they dealt with HIV and they eventually figured it out, they were going to figure out. It's Rochelle Walensky, the same way, CDC director, expert in HIV. A lot of these people are HIV people. And they tried to, that's why you started seeing things like, lockdowns. Let's do lockdowns. Well, okay, let me tell you something. A lockdown will work if you want to keep people separated. If they're going to pass things through direct sexual or blood contact, yes, it's going to stop it from happening. We know that's true, right? But this is a respiratory virus. And what's going to happen is it's going to, once the lockdown's over, it's going to start, spreading again, just like crazy, masks, don't really work, so they took all these ideas that they had from HIV and how to deal with HIV, and they tried to apply it to a respiratory virus. And I think it's why they screwed up, we know they screwed up because despite what they say about how smart they think they are, and no one thinks he's smarter than anyone than Tony Fauci. Tony Fauci's smarter than you. He's smarter than me. He's smarter than our two IQs combined. He's smarter than both of us, right? But these guys can't admit that they made mistakes. Even to this day, they can't admit it, even in retrospect.
Well, I think it's, to their interest not to admit that. And I think there's a little probably a little bit of flop sweat in Tony Fauci world, and I think that's why he's changed his tune and lies so completely. It's like, I never said this, I never said whatnot. But the other aspect, kind of the Hillary Clinton Obama aspect to this, is the kind of the money part. NIH is constructed. I forget the name of the act, but there's money to be had if your therapeutic gets chosen. There's a lot of internecine kind of copulation, I guess, between pharmaceutical and government. You can get your regulatory capture money. You become, you can be Scott Gottlieb and leave government and get a board seat at Pfizer. And then there's money that comes in from Pfizer, one that helps support NIH stuff. And then you also get patents by being a researcher NIH if your stuff gets chosen. I think there was first, I think the first aspect was cover your butt, where they were complicit with the actual origin of SARS. And so they had to come up with something else. And I think this basically kind of like the arsonist in the fire department. I think they came up with the idea like, okay, well, we started the fire. We can't be found out for starting the fire. We're going to show how great we are at putting out fires. We're going to make the fire even bigger and put out a super duper fire with our super duper new weapon, upon which we later will capitalize. So I think the mRNA stuff, which had never passed had never passed phase 2 and phase 3 trials, that became the modality. You had to keep everyone locked down, which is, lockdown itself is a prison term. It had never been used in public health. And it had been used literally twice in public health. Once in the kind of ironically named Freetown in Sierra Leone for an Ebola episode, and that's just for a couple of weeks. And they didn't lock down on the sanctimony, on the sacred days of Friday for the Muslims and Sunday for the Christians and whatnot. So they were locked down 5 out of 7 days. Quote, not really lockdown. The other lockdown was in some tuberculosis hospital prison hospital in South Africa, but never had been used in public health. And they had fantasized it. They kind of had these wet dreams, on these little pandemic.
No, I think they used it for SARS in Canada. Their first outbreak that because that was Mark Lipsich's from Harvard. I think that was his solution was, they used public health measures to stop that outbreak, but that was only because the transfer rate was low enough, that you could interrupt it. It wasn't passed on that easily or that fast.
I don't know. I'll recheck that. I think it may very well have been used in 2003 SARS, classic SARS in China, because there was upheaval. The real
no, in Canada, not.
I see what you're saying. It may very well have been in China, but there was not really we don't have full transparency now, but there was no social media going on in 2003 to investigate these things. But they did have apparently some riots in China, which is the real, that's their real immune spot. They don't want they have Tiananmen Square anxiety, and they don't want that again. And they were shuttling people from place to place, and potentially with SARS. And some of the recipient cities had riots, not wanting the SARS people from other places. So they were doing population level mechanics, presumably like lockdown, because it's China, because they could. But when the people started revolting, so this kind of segues into a little minor point we touched on later, but whether China was producing a vaccine for SARS. After 2003 SARS, because that had been such a kind of a jolt to the system, they didn't want any riots and whatnot. They worked hard on making a vaccine to original SARS, 2003 SARS, and they gave it up eventually because they had ADE, antibody dependent enhancement issues, and they tried it in ferrets and whatnot as a model, and they spent like a decade on this, and they were the country most concerned about SARS and making a vaccine to it, and they failed. And why they failed, I think, is interesting and possibly foreshadows some of the failures with the second round of vaccine, but doesn't really explain why we were so gung-ho about it. We adopted so much of the kind of draconian Chinese aspects and abandoned our own concepts of liberty. And I think this is part of the kind of complicit money aspect where Dr. Fauci, et cetera, had invested in Wuhan. And essentially they had kind of cross-invested in the minds of some of our top people and made them have to bend because they didn't want to have their complicity uncovered.
Well, I think part of the thing is, I think people I've spoken to have told me that they suspect that he knew pretty early on this thing was possibly a bioweapon, and was probably pretty much more panicked than he ever let on. And that may have been why he did this flip-flop on masks, this flip-flop on the lockdowns. It was like, we've got to do something, pretend that we're doing something.
Yeah, I don't think so. I think he followed the Diamond Princess at the time. He talked about it. There's a speech I referenced in my article in February 2020, and he knew about the data from the Diamond Princess. Nobody, but to that point, frankly, when everything kind of happened in March 10th or so, around the Ides of March, where Trump kind of went from a swish to a gung ho, avid lockdownist. I think he was told something. Jeffrey Tucker's theory is that he was told it was a Chinese bioweapon. I'll go with that. But something happened around then. He the experts, such as they were, kind of infused his mind that this was a much worse thing than it was. But I don't think the people within in Dr. Fauci world and himself following the Diamond Princess, which if you'd want to engineer an experiment like this and get 3,700 people on a boat and give them an unknown virus from China, you'd have to spend $1 trillion to get everyone signed off a waiver. And
right.
But we had this perfect experiment, and nobody had died by March. Ultimately, by June, there were 10 deaths. Median age 82, but probably none of them were literally from SARS-CoV-2. And so, the data were there that this was not that bad a thing. Only people who really got sick were oldsters, the youngsters, the middle-aged people, and youngsters. Any young adult children had no symptoms, and the young adults had nothing basically, and no illness and so forth. So I think they knew. I just think they, wanted to get. I think they had wanted to get their own tattoo off, and it was going to take time. They were scarred by the fact that they were complicit in bringing this thing to light, having spent money and putting it in China, which they should never have done. And I think they were just they just went into deep cover your butt mode, and they made things far worse. It was like the Watergate theorem. So what it wasn't the action, was the cover up. I think it's the cover up what screwed things up for everybody. And we're still suffering for it. And unfortunately, I don't know if he will or not, but it doesn't look like he will be per se.
Well, I mean, we don't know because there's a group of state AGs who just sent a letter to Congress just last week, I think, asking for more information, saying that they were looking into Tony Fauci because what his pardon was for federal crimes, but if he could be charged with any state crimes for any of his actions, he can be charged for those. He's not protected from state crimes. So they're already casting about, looking for possibilities. It was something like 15 attorneys general that were like looking for this stuff. It was a letter that came out last week. And the other thing that happened too is he can be brought back in and be deposed again. Senator Johnson just sent a letter 2 weeks ago asking to get emails from Fauci that he had been denied, that had been covered up in the past, or he got redacted copies of. I know that Senator Paul is going to keep investigating, and I reported that Energy and Commerce, the House Energy and Commerce Committee, is going to keep investigating. They can pull him in and they can ask him, when you said this, were you lying, right? If he lies about the fact when he lied, he could be prosecuted for lying to Congress. He knows this. Yeah. And he knows this because I sent
both of our IQs.
I sent that exact question to his lawyer and asked him, is he aware of this? This pardon does not protect him from this. So Tony knows this. He knows what the deal is.
So we're rounding out the hour. The thing that my little chew toy lately, I'm thinking of writing on, that expression, gold bars off the Titanic. Project Veritas, I think, found some guy. I think it was an EPA or whatever, and we're sending billions of dollars out to these NGOs because Trump's going to come in. We want the money to be out there, and kind of like whole life insurance, avoiding the tax scheme.
Right.
Give money to your kids is kind of like a wormhole to send the money out.
Right.
So the wormhole money, gold bars, Titanic analogy I'm thinking of is this $600 million to Moderna for bird flu. I'm wondering if you have any thought about that, because this was engineered, only announced T-minus 3 days before the inauguration, like January 17th or something like that. $600 million. Is that a done deal? Can you get the contract? Can anybody figure this stuff out? Can this be undone by the Trump administration? I personally think bird flu may be a bad flu for birds, but I don't think it's really kind of rippled out that much for humans so much. And why should we spend $600 million? And does it kind of reek of this gold bars of the Titanic? Is it for debts yet to be paid? Is it kind of like a regulatory capture pre-cycle?
I mean, Look, a lot theoretically, bird flu, when it eventually happens, it's going to be a bad. Like, a lot of people keep saying this over and over again. It's going to be bad. The problem is like, when's it going to happen? How much money are we going to keep investing in it? And this is like the big fight right now. In public health, they're all keyed up. For more investments in virus. I mean, like the stories come out like every 2 days in the media about more bird flu. They killed and some of the stories are crazy. Like there was one story I read where it said that they with PCR they detected virus particles in cow milk. After it had been pasteurized, and I was like, wait, hold on. The point of pasteurization is to kill the virus, and yes, you're going to find virus particles after pasteurization because it didn't totally destroy the virus. It's like, I don't understand what the point is. Like, it was the craziest, stupidest article, right? There's more and more articles about bird flu constantly hitting and about the need to do everything, and how we can't have a sort of refocus of public health into dealing with chronic diseases, something that we know is killing people right now. Yeah. It's not a theoretical thing that might happen next season, or something that starts in China and then gets transferred over. It is killing Americans today. Millions of Americans die every year because of chronic diseases. The obesity rates are crazy. And so what we're trying to do is refocus. And I think as they refocus, what you're going to see is more and more of this clamoring to let's do viruses and let's have more about vaccines. I mean, to me, one of the funniest things is how, places like Public Citizen, right? Traditionally, very much, activists going after big pharma, and they've been totally silent on all the problems with the vaccines. Like, I've not seen a single press release about them coming out anything about any vaccine side effects. Alex Berenson wrote a piece. He found out that in some of the clinical trial data for the Pfizer vaccine, it was reported that a kid had died. It was an adverse event, a small child. I posted this on Facebook. I had reporters making comments like, well, yeah, but the vaccine was still effective and everything. I was like, that's not the point. The point is the company lied and hid the fact that there was an adverse event and a girl died. Like, don't you get that's the point? Like, it doesn't it was the craziness that you see right now with Democrats around vaccines. I think that, to me, that's a weird cultural change, which
yeah. Well, I think everything is team sport. Right here. I grew up in New York City, and I've been in Boston for 40 years, and kind of over time, we go to the Celtics. We don't go to the Knicks. I've got some brothers, and one of them, is really angry at me for going to Red Sox games at all. It's like, how can you? You're a Yankee fan. Dad was a Yankee fan. You're a Yankee, whatever. This is a stamp. And I think, it's like, well, what happens when Johnny Damon changes teams? Now you hate him one day, now you love him the next day. I don't think there's much rationality to it. It's a team sport. I think all these things kind of are imbued. If you work for, in the public interest or whatever, it's only the public interest if it's on your team is getting better. So if you get a higher draft pick, then you're happy about it. You get, your team loses, you're sad. Whatever. I just think all this stuff is crazy. And as far as trading, obviously we've gotten a few trades from the Democrats. We have kind of in power, RFK Jr., Tulsi Gabbard, Elon Musk, Donald Trump himself, all Democrats.
I know. And
it's the horrible people because they change teams. They're not on the Red Sox anymore. They're on the Yankees or vice versa.
I posted this actually on Facebook, and my joke was, it's like think about it. You're such a terrible party that your people are leaving, and they're succeeding in the other party because you've driven them out. Don't you take that as a message? Doesn't that make you stop and think? What are we doing wrong? They're leaving us and they're going to the other side and then beating us. Just stop and think for a moment, but can't happen.
I just think they basically got addicted. It's a sadness. I treated narcotic addiction ancillary to my regular medical practice, detoxing with Suboxone. And they're human beings. They have souls and so forth, but they've kind of given themselves up to a pleasure, to getting this narcotic initially, and then they have to keep having it. And so, they can become unaddicted. But I think the Democrat Party got addicted to, kind of financial crack. And it's That's where they are. They're just like desperate now. They don't know where the next hit's coming from. They'll do anything to get it. You know, I had drug addicts, you know, ostensibly, I mean, we're all God's children, you know, born from man and woman, and they would, you know, sell their grandmother, you know, they'd literally go sift through all their stuff and you know, take their credit cards, take their mom's credit cards and wipe out the household, to take the TV, you know, they would do anything for their fix. And that's what we're seeing right now. We're seeing this kind of hugely addicted, you know, kind of early withdrawal phase. And hopefully, you know, they get over the hump, whatever.
I'm going to say one last thing and then we have to go because my computer's going to shut down. I got to go and plug it in. It's funny you bring that up because I was talking to a friend of mine who I know from, because we both worked on the Hill, and he told me a similar thing to you. He's also like, he worked for the Democrats and now is just totally appalled with the party and actually voted for Trump. And he told me he thinks the problem with the Democratic Party, it's the problem is that at the top, they don't care about the voters because, you know, what's really driving the party's agenda now are all these rich, you know, billionaire foundations and funders. And so the consultants who are creating and guiding what the party's going to do, they don't want to piss those people off because they want to keep the nice house in Chevy Chase. You know, they want to keep living in the nice areas in New York. And so they don't want to step forward and say, you know what, we got to refix things. We got to really go get back to trying to serve the underclass, traditionally what we did, because they're losing those people now. And so they're going to keep doing what they're doing, which is servicing the sort of coastal elites. And it's why we keep seeing this craziness about stuff that no one really cares about, like trans people in sports. That's a toxic issue that like the majority of people in America don't support, but it's captured their party. And that's my kind of final thing. And then I'm gonna have to go because otherwise my computer's going to die. And we're not going to say
Thank you so much, Paul, for being on. People can find you at your Disinformation Chronicle Substack and at PD Thacker, if I'm not mistaken, on X.
No, Thacker PD.
Thacker PD. Okay, sorry about that. So it's kind of like Thacker Police Department. And here, if they want to support my video cast, they can go buy my book. It's on Amazon. It's called Overturning Zika. It has only peripherally anything to do with what we discussed today. But it's even better if they read it, but at least buy it and help support my podcast. Thank you so much, Paul.
Thanks for having me on. Bye, everyone.